In this video, we'll go ahead and take a look at type 5 factoring. This is when we have a polynomial with 3 terms, so it's a trinomial. It's in the form of x squared plus bx plus c. However, this time we have a coefficient that is not 1. So we already know what to do when our coefficient is 1. We've practiced this on previous videos. We take an x box and we figure out what two numbers multiply to c but then add up to b. We're going to work a little bit differently. Let's take a look at our first example. It says factor 2x squared minus 7x plus 3. Back in the day, I learned the guess and check method, which means that we just kind of go ahead and list all the factors of a and c, and then we try and make some different combinations that will work in this. Of course, we always try and factor out a GCF first. It can be very tricky to do that. So I'm going to give you a strategy that will help. Well, let's take a look at this a little bit bigger. There we go. So in order to do type 4 factoring, we're really going to do the factor by grouping method, which is what we learned previously. We're going to try first to factor out a GCF if there is one. We're going to multiply a and c together and find factors of a and c that will add or subtract to b. We're going to split up our middle two terms and do type 2 techniques, which is grouping by factoring, and then we'll verify. So those are our steps. It seems quite complicated, but let's see if we can break it down. Here's our first example, 2x minus 7x plus 3. The first thing we're going to do is multiply a and c. So 2 times 3 is 6. So we're going to build an x box where we put 6 in the top and minus 7 in the bottom. So that's where the difference lies. Before we just put the last number in the top and we put the middle term in the bottom. This time we have to multiply because it's not a positive 1. We're going to multiply 2 times 3 to get 6. So now we're trying to come up with the factors that multiply to 6, but that will add up to negative 7. I know it's going to be some combination of 1 and 6. If they add up to a negative, then they both should be negative there, because when we multiply two negatives together, we get the positive. So negative 1 and negative 6. Okay, great. We have our x box. Now what do we do with it? So we're going to, instead of just writing two binomials, we're going to rewrite our trinomial here in 4 terms. We're going to keep the first term, 2x squared. We're going to keep the last term, 3, and we're breaking up this middle 2 term using our side pieces here from our x box. We're going to attach an x to each of them. So I'm going to write down minus 1x, and then I'm going to write down minus 6x, and the 3, I forgot to put that, was positive. So now you should see you have 4 terms. This is what we learned in our last video. If you don't recall how to factor this, go ahead and check out our previous video on type 4, factor by grouping, factoring 4 terms. If you do remember, let's continue. We go ahead and slice this down the center. So we're breaking it up into 2 pieces, each with 2 terms. And now we're going to do our GCF. The greatest common factor of 2x squared minus 1x is going to be an x squared. And then we write our leftovers, 2x. Oh, I'm sorry, I wrote down our greatest common factor was x squared, but I meant x. Let's fix that. Our greatest common factor is just an x. When we divide by x, we get 2x, and then we get a minus 1 over here. Now we'll take a look at the second half and see what our GCF is there. Remember, we said if we can, we should pull out a negative, so the leading coefficient of the second half is not negative. So we're going to pull out a negative 3 here. Divide everything by negative 3, we should get an x. 2x minus 1. So now you can see that we've got the same terms in parentheses there. That becomes our greatest common factor. And our leftovers are x minus 3. Put this first term binomial there in parentheses. Now I highly suggest when you're doing this type 5 factoring that you go ahead and double check by multiplying your polynomials together just to make sure you got the middle. So we're going to go ahead and do that on this one. We have 2x times x, that's going to be 2x squared. And we have 2x times negative 3, that's negative 6x. We have negative 1 times x, that's negative 1x. And we have 2 times negative 3, that's going to be negative 6. Oops, I did my foiling wrong. Let's go ahead and check that. I said it was 2x times negative 3, but that's not correct. Were you checking that with me? Let's see. This one was 2x minus 1. And over here we had x minus 3. We did 2x times x to get 2x squared. We did 2x times negative 3 to get the negative 6x. Then we do negative 1 times x to get negative 1x. And we do negative 1 times negative 3 to get the positive 3. When you check, you should be able to see why we do what we do. We multiply the a times c to get the top term in our x box to figure out what we're multiplying. Then you can also see how we're breaking up that middle term. So we're going to combine these two and we'll get 2x squared minus 7x plus 3. So this was the check. This, however, in parentheses, got a little messy there, is your answer. 2x minus 1 and x minus 3. Let's go ahead and factor our next one. Let's see if we can do that. I'm going to start by multiplying a and c together. That's 30. That goes in the top of my x box. And 13 goes in the middle, or in the bottom. I'm trying to come up with two numbers that multiply to 30 but add up to 13. We could do 10 and 3. 10 times 3 is 30. 10 plus 3 is 13. That would work. Or we could say 2 and 15, but I'm not sure that's going to add up to 13. So we're going to do 10 times 3. All right, so once we have our x box, we're going to go ahead and rewrite everything. We've got 15x squared, and we have the 2. The a and the c. The first and the last term, they stay the same, but we're going to break up this 13x into 10x and 3x. And our 2 is positive. Now we go into that type 4 factoring. We split it in half. We take out the greatest common factor. In this case, it's going to be 5x. And we'll have our leftovers of x. Oops. 15 divided by 5 is going to be 3. So let's put the 3 in here. 3x. And then 10x divided by 5x is just going to be plus 2. Now notice in the second half, we don't have any GCF there, but I do still have to write something out. So I'm going to put a plus 1 there. I can divide everything by 1. And we'll still have 3x plus 2 in our parentheses. Take a look. That's the same. So that's great. That's our greatest common factor, 3x plus 2. And we write our leftovers behind, 5x plus 1. Now definitely check. Do your FOIL or your double distribution. 3x times 5x is 15x squared. 3x times 1 is 3x. 2 times 5x is 10x. And 2 times 1 is 2. Put together your middle two terms and you'll get that 13x, which is what we were looking for there for our b term. And there you have it. You go ahead and practice your type 4 factoring or type 5 factoring. Remember, this is when you have a trinomial with a leading coefficient other than 1. If you have a GCF, you should pull that out first and then do this method. Go ahead and pause it and see how you do with these. All right, we'll take a look at our first 3. They were pretty straightforward. There was no GCF to pull out. All we had to do was take a look and recognize we have a leading coefficient other than 1. So we go ahead and multiply our first and our last term together to get the top of the x box. The middle term coefficient goes in the bottom. And we figured out what two numbers multiply to the top but add to the bottom. Set it up in 4 factors, split it, do factor by grouping, and we have our answers there. Always remember that you can, once you get your answers, your factors, go ahead and double check by multiplying back and making sure you're getting back exactly what you started with. When we move on to our next 3 examples, D and E get a little more complicated. So check all of this step by step here. Our first step was to recognize that we had a negative coefficient. So we go ahead and pull out the -1. And we rewrite whatever's left over. So this turned into 4x squared minus 12x minus 7. From there, that is what we put into our x box. And we find our 2 side pieces that become that middle term. And notice my GCF is coming along for the ride in every step because I don't want to forget about it. I do my factor by grouping. I'll find my final answer to be -1, parentheses, 2x minus 7, 2x plus 1. In letter E, I'm not sure if you recognize this or not, but each term could be divisible by 2. So that's your GCF. Even with these, with a leading coefficient other than 1, you still want to look to see if you have a greatest common factor. In this case, we do it with 2. So 2 pulls out, and we have 4x squared plus 11x minus 3 in parentheses, and the 4 times -3 goes in the top, 11 in the bottom. Find your 2 side pieces, break that middle term up into 2 pieces, and go ahead and do factor by grouping. Always remember to bring your GCF along for the ride. It is part of your answer here. It is a factor. We have 2, 4x minus 1, and x plus 3. Letter F goes back to the basics. We've got a trinomial with leading coefficient other than 1. Again, we multiply a and c to get the number at the top. Add them up, or multiply, but also add them to find the number in the bottom. And complete factor by grouping. And that concludes our lesson here on factoring type 5 factors or polynomials. This would be where our leading coefficient is something other than 1. Reminder, you should always factor out a GCF first and then decide what kind of polynomial you have left. Is it a binomial? In that case, maybe it's the difference of perfect squares. Is it a trinomial? If it is, then you can do your x box, but keep in mind, if it's a trinomial of with a leading coefficient other than 1, then you have to multiply the first and the last term together to get that top number and do factor by grouping. And if it's 4 terms, then you're set to just factor by grouping.